Welcome back, listeners. It's another episode of the Inspired Writer Collective podcast, and we are your co-hosts, Elizabeth and Stephanie. It's been, a fun fall over here. I just got done wrapping up what was the latest round of the Memoir Master Plan Cohort. This last round ran for 6 weeks, but based off of the feedback I'm getting from everyone that participated, I think the next round's going to be expanded to 8 weeks, which will be really fun to have that extra time to really dig into those plot points and character development pieces and all the stuff that, we include within that program. Um, and now, Stephanie, you and I are finally have time to get back to some of our writing through our weekly writing sessions.
Yeah, it's been really nice to finally get back into the groove. And I know I set a challenge for myself in September for 1,000 words a day. And while it's not all words for my manuscript, it has gotten me back in the rhythm of writing every day, which I had, of course, with life events and such, had kind of fallen off that pattern. But I'm finding it is just bringing ideas back, and it's nice that we get to have our writing sessions in the afternoon now that we're getting back into that rhythm, which is nice. And just having those touch points of, as we've talked about so often, the writing in community and having knowing that there's someone on the other side of the screen, even when we have our screen blacked out, audio off, just knowing that you're there makes it so much easier to show up to write.
Yeah, plus I just love knowing, like, in my schedule for the week, like, okay, Mondays are writing day and Thursdays are writing day this week. And, it ends up shifting depending on what kind of appointments we have or things. But, we've started to send out emails to those that are interested in joining us. We used to send it out, really broadly to our whole email list, and that just didn't really seem functional when we had to cancel last minute or something. Um, but if there are some of you that are interested in joining us for that writing time, shoot us a message, send us an email so we can connect you with those times. Basically, I send out the Zoom links at the beginning of the week, and then you just pop in for whichever ones work for you. And it's usually a pretty consistent afternoon time. So if that time's not good for you, then that's okay. You can catch our virtual writing retreats quarterly otherwise. But that's just the time that we meet, and we're happy to expand that to you guys if that's something of interest to you. Today, though, we want to dig into a conversation about memoir structure. Memoir is really interesting in the sense that you're trying to condense real lived experiences into a narrative form, and that can be really challenging. Obviously, most people tend to start with a classic linear narrative that's in chronological order. You pick your beginning part, you pick where it ends, where you've learned your lesson, where you've, changed and maybe have a new belief about the world or yourself. And then everything in between is told chronologically, and there's not really any large gaps of time missing. And if there are gaps of time, it's sort of summarized in a brief paragraph to keep the reader kind of up to date on where you're at. And it's all really rooted in sort of a chronological timeline. And that can be really difficult for some memoir topics. So, this was something that I really dug into after reading Deep Memoir by Jennifer Selig. So, if you are struggling with structure, I recommend that book as a starting point. That is the book that's been the foundation of the newest lesson that I've added to the Memoir Master Plan Cohort. Structure was a big part of our conversation in this latest round, and it was super impactful because the stories that these women were wanting to share and write, most of them did not belong in a linear structure. That if the reader got really hung up on where the chronological timeline was, like, it would get confusing, or it just wasn't the intention behind the writing. And so they needed some structures that were not rooted in the chronological storytelling. And that can be really tricky because, like, Stephanie, most of what we see, most of like the movies we watch, the books we read, they're told linearly. So that's kind of our natural leaning.
Well, and I think it's one of the places that as you've talked in the past, and it's been a little while, of where people have a confusion between memoir and autobiography or biography, and they think it's the same thing. They think they have to fit everything in and smush it all together. And as you say, that's not the purpose of memoir. And of course, listeners, we've talked about core message. And when you find that core message, that then leads you into figuring out, okay, well, what's the structure that works around that core message? And I think that that was one of the pieces, especially in this go round of the cohort, was there that the women already had an idea of where they were going. And so it was more important to lean into structure a lot and figure out, okay, what's the best way to tell your story?
Oh, I'm so glad you said that. Yes. So I have like in that memoir structure lesson that the structure of the book is basically like the skeleton, and landing on the right structure, the how to tell the story piece is almost as important as identifying the core message of what story to tell, right? They really go hand in hand. And there are 8 different structures that I outline and teach within that program. Obviously, we don't have time within a single podcast to dig into all of those, but there are some really common ones. I would say 4 of them are probably the most common ones, and that would be linear, as we've just kind of talked about, your standard chronological storytelling from point A to point Z. There's also framed, circular, and thematic. And it's interesting because I had writers in this last group land in sort of each of those different categories. Framed is probably the closest to linear, and one that I think really supports a lot of writers who will otherwise need to provide a lot of backstory if they wrote linearly. And basically, what the framed structure looks like is you have a main storyline, and that is still told linearly, like a point A to Z sequence of events. An example of this style of book is Wild by Cheryl Strayed. So her main storyline is her hiking the PCT. We start with her at the beginning of the hiking. We end with her at like the end point, the finish line. But within that storytelling, that framework, hence framed memoir structure, she falls back into other memories that help us understand the ways in which she felt lost in other times of her life, because that's her bigger theme, is being lost. And those are not told chronologically. At some point we're going back to her childhood. At some points we're going back to her marriage or the boyfriend that she was sleeping with and doing drugs with. I mean, and none of that is chronological. The reader is not given any kind of like before or after to really root that in any sort of timeline. It's merely told in support of the broader message of feeling lost. Whereas the story of being on the trail really holds all of that. So while there is still like a chronological element, those other pieces are not chronological. And a greater part of the story is the frame story. When you're doing the frame memoir, you have to be mindful about your pacing. You have to be mindful about how long you go into some sort of backstory, and it all has to be really interesting and compelling to keep the reader moving forward. So you do have to be really mindful of that. But it's a great way for someone who has a story where the event that they really want to talk about happens maybe more recently, but there's stuff in the more historical past that's important in order to explain how that present moment of the frame story is being impacted and the impact it's having on the author.
Well, and I think in the example of Wild, it's a fake event something that she's engaging in. If anybody listening, if you have been a through hiker or someone who enjoys that, it does extend over a significant amount of time. There's a lot that happens, and so it definitely lends itself to that, creating almost like a box around it, and then you can fill it in, and it's not, and it also is really natural for just the human experience, that when we have an experience like that, other thoughts come up for you. So it engages the reader because they're like, oh yeah, if I'm out in nature and I'm doing this, it's going to bring up things, or if I'm having a certain experience, it's going to trigger certain memories. And it does help, especially, if you're not sure how to structure what you're writing, it provides that nice little container. Now I'm going to put all the pieces in that were part of that experience.
Right. So, for example, say you were writing a memoir about your motherhood journey, right? And so the frame story is taking place on you, maybe your attempts at becoming pregnant and what that looked like, and then pregnancy, and then becoming a mother, and then the early motherhood journey as your kids grow up. But then maybe you have these flashbacks, this backstory that comes in as you experience these different things back to your own childhood, back to, your college days, back to whatever that like helps aid the reader's understanding of that primary story and your experience of it. And that's the thing you have to be mindful of is like the stories you kind of fall back into that are outside of the chronological storytelling have to serve something in that main storyline, right? Like it's giving the reader some additional insight as to why you may be struggling in this moment, or why you had a certain assumption of what this would look like based off of your previous experience. And it's all serving whatever bigger theme or core message that you're trying to portray throughout your memoir.
Absolutely. I think it's really important to really make sure that the relevant points that you're bringing up, so that your reader doesn't get steered off in all different directions, and that you can't be all over the place. I mean, there
Right.
has to be a purpose for what you're bringing in.
Right. Another style, structure style that's a little bit similar to framed in that there's sort of a main storyline and then a different storyline is the circular memoir. This is particularly helpful for writers who are writing about grief or trauma. So
Really.
the way that this is a little bit different is that there's a different balance of the stories when you have a circular structure. So, whereas in the frame structure, you're primarily in that main chronological story and only short little excerpts into, past events, this is sort of flip flopped where some sort of past event is so big that it keeps coming back up in the way that you are the central memory. You're working through it, you're worrying about it, you're rethinking it, you're turning it over and over, revealing, layer by layer of detail every time you revisit this moment. So, this really helps portray to the reader sort of that natural fixation that we have on traumatic events.
Yeah.
Something that Jennifer Selig says in her book about the structure. She says, the circular structure makes a great deal of sense when writing about traumatic events, particularly those that strike us like sudden shocks that cleave our lives into before and after. It speaks to the repetitive nature of trauma with its tendency toward intrusive thoughts. So
Mhm.
here, once again, as is so beautiful in memoir, the structure is mimicking the message, right? Like there's something very big and traumatic. So we as the reader are constantly revisiting this moment, this traumatic moment that the author has experienced, just as you would if this was you and these thoughts just suddenly pop in and you're once again thrown back into some imagery of something you've previously experienced or some grief, the way that people describe grief and the way that it pops up and surprises you. That's
Mhm.
what this structure does. And this is a well known structure. All of these are archetypes of structure that have worked for a number of memoirs, not just, a single one. That's why these are compiled within Selig's book, Deep Memoir. An example of this is Joan Didion's book, A Year of Magical Thinking, where her circular theme, the one that she keeps going back to, is her husband's sudden death. And so while there's other events that happen, um, and those are chronological, she is constantly being pulled back into these past memories. And those memories are the bulk of the book as opposed to the chronological storytelling of, the year. following his death. So even though we start at a point that's like after his passing, we're constantly drawn back to this previous, moments and the memories of him before he passed and all of
Mm.
that.
Well, and I think that that's what makes memoir so great is one, all these different structures we're talking about. But in a book like that, I know when my mom passed away, that was a book that was immediately recommended to me to read. And I can see why, especially now being even further from the event. But at the time, I wasn't sure that I wanted to dig into exploring grief at the time since I was living it so closely. But I see now reflecting that it does, it reflects that what happens when you have that kind of trauma of just naturally you memories come up, experiences. I mean, it's been over 10 years now and things still bring it back. And so what's helpful is just that it's relatable from the human experience. It's you know
Exactly.
that you're not alone, that other people are experiencing it, and that's what's so beautiful about memoir. And for those of you listening, if you're working on a memoir and thinking that, oh, other people have already experienced this, but no, they haven't because they haven't experienced it like you have. They haven't had your experience, and you have your way of telling it that will help, even if it's just one person to start with, and then you never know who else will be impacted. And that's what's beautiful. And as you say, with the circular piece where you keep coming back and touching upon what the central memory was, but then how it bleeds into other aspects of life.
Yeah, and I think this could be really helpful too if someone's writing about something that is a really traumatic incident where they want to be mindful of their reader and not totally give all the details in one very concentrated way that could be really traumatic to the reader and overwhelming. This would be a really nice way to unfold something that's
Mhm.
big and messy and ugly in a way that the reader can digest more slowly because you're only getting like a layer at a time with each, revisit back to that traumatic moment or that moment of grief or whatever.
Well, and as we know with traumatic experiences too, sometimes all of the experience doesn't keep coming back to you. I- if it's something that you remember, you'll remember pieces of it. And so it's the same way in writing your memoir in that way, is that, we one, like you said, we don't want to bombard the reader with the experience because that's can be a lot, but it's the natural way that memories can come back to us.
Exactly. In some ways, it feels a little bit more true to the way it was lived, right? And in the sense that maybe you didn't remember all of it at this point, but then something else happened and then you remembered a little bit more, and then something else happened and you remembered a little bit more. It's just more true to the experience when you can tell it this way with a circular structure, as opposed to trying to, you know, dissect all the pieces, put them in chronological order, and tell the story linearly.
Yeah, exactly.
And some stories don't really belong in any sort of chronological order at all. We've talked through now three different structures that at least have some essence of a chronological storytelling, whether it's the major story, the minor story. But there's also thematic memoirs, and there are a large number of thematic memoirs. Most of what, like if you look at Glennon Doyle's Untamed, that's a thematic memoir where it's not told chronologically. She has broken her stories and experiences down into themes. So she starts with cages and then keys and then I don't remember all the different names of them. But she has these different themes, and within them, she has these vignettes or short stories or moments. And we, as the reader, are not meant to get stuck on how this falls in a particular timeline of her life. The beautiful thing about removing the chronological storytelling is that you are forcing the reader to then focus on your theme, your core message. And when you've broken your book up into those themes, then you are drawing their attention more acutely to how this particular story relates to that theme. Um, There's a book that I haven't read, but it's outlined in Deep Memoir. It's by Maggie O'Farrell, and it's called I Am 17 Brushes with Death. And in her book, she tells about these 16 different um, incidents of where she's had damage to body parts, infections, whatever, whole body things where, her life's at risk. And those are told non chronologically. So we as a reader are not locked into what order these things are happening. She doesn't want us hung up on that. It doesn't matter because the last chapter is about her daughter and her daughter's battle with severe allergies, an immune system disorder, chronic eczema that causes her to scratch her skin off. And so it's only in that final chapter that the reader gets to really appreciate that this is actually a bigger story about a mother who has had to experience all these different things for herself and now has to hold space for her daughter to
Mm.
experience it and the wisdom that she brings to that because of all of her previous 16 experiences. And if it were told linearly, it wouldn't have that same impact, right? Just like Glennon Doyle's stories, where she groups them with the ways that she felt caged, right? Those weren't just childhood things. There was stories from adulthood there too. And then the keys, the ways that she learned different things and started advocating for herself and unlocking things. It really helps the reader to focus on, that bigger message that you as the writer are trying to share. If you break your story up into these themes, if that's appropriate for the message you're trying to share, and not focus on, that this is a great option where like the backstory would be really messy, or like providing the context around each of these moments would be cumbersome because they cover a much larger time frame. Like, example, in Glennon's book, I mean, it's essentially covering her whole life, and but it's just little snippets. And so in order to not have to fill in all the blanks of this timeline and this timeline and this timeline, it's told thematically all around this concept of Untamed.
Well, and it makes it really digestible for the reader, uh, with a themed memoir, because then you're not, having to remember all these different aspects of a person's life, but you're really able to, as the reader, bring yourself to the memoir more readily because you're connecting automatically to like, oh yeah, you know, I felt caged at this point in my life, or oh, those are experiences. Oh, I can connect that to myself because, of course, there's always a selfish piece for readers coming to, pick up a book, especially with a memoir. One is, in the case of Glennon Doyle, is there's the curiosity already because she's a well known person. But even if you're not so well known, if you're using the thematic approach and putting it into shorter stories, that might also, for you as a writer, be a way that it's easier for you to show up and tell your story, is that you're not feeling like you have to give all of the details, that you can share these little pieces of your life. You don't have to put everything about yourself on the page, but that you're still able to connect with your reader.
Yeah. And another kind of subcategory of this, which is a little bit different, is the memoir and essay. And it's basically a combination of disconnected short stories. So think of like back in the day when we were reading Chicken Soup for the blank insert, theme, right? And so it's like where the theme is across the entire book, as opposed to like what I just described with Glennon Doyle's Untamed, where she has multiple themes within the book, or like Eat, Pray, Love, where Liz Gilbert has those themes. Um, this is where the theme goes across the entire book, but it's told in disjointed, unconnected, non-chronological short essay, and that's the memoir and essay structure. So there's so many different options, and that's what I hope that you are getting from this episode, listener, is just that freedom to kind of like shake your shoulders off. Like, you don't have to stick to a linear structure, and there are a lot of memoirs that are better served by choosing a different structure. Now, I only went over 4 of those today. But there are 8 different ones that are outlined within Deep Memoir by Jennifer Selig. So check that out if you don't think one of these really resonated, but you get the inclination that linear is not for you. Um, I just want people to like understand that there's so much freedom in how you can write your memoir. And also, these are tried and true structures. Like, this isn't like, some off the wall, thing. Like, these have been replicated over and over again. These are structures that a reader will be familiar with. And so these are all wonderful things to consider. And like you said, Stephanie, at the beginning, like it's it's equally as important to land on the appropriate structure for your memoir as it is to come to terms with what your core message is and what stories you want to tell that are associated with that. So, it may be helpful, actually, listener, to start with just a timeline of what stories you want to include and where they fall in a timeline. And if it's a really condensed timeline, yeah, maybe linear or framed is a good place to start. If it's not super condensed, then maybe something like circular or thematic is the better approach. So maybe looking at a timeline would help you gain some clarity around which direction to go or even just what to try. There's no harm in outlining for 2 different structures and see which one really, feels like it gets the message across most clearly or supports your theme the best.
Well, and listener, if you're not really sure and you get started, there is going to be another round of the Memoir Master Plan Cohort opening up again in the spring. And so you'll definitely want to get on our embodied writing experience list so that you don't miss the opportunity to be invited to be a part of that cohort. The spots are limited for a purpose, and the offers go out to our list before we open it up more broadly. So if you want some support and you want to learn from Elizabeth and get her guidance, which just absolutely so worth it, then I highly recommend that you get on our list so that you don't miss those opportunities and any other pieces that pop up. There's so much happening here, and we really would love to invite you to connect.
Yeah, thank you, listener. We've got one more month of episodes coming your way throughout November, and then we will be taking our seasonal break as we have gifted ourselves that we do twice a year in December and in June. So hop on that email list, keep up to date on what we're doing behind the scenes, and happy listening.